The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 2, Side 2. Chapter 3, The Progress of Christianity, 364 to 451. The foster mother of the new civilization was the Church. As the old order faded away in corruption, cowardice, and neglect, a unique army of churchmen rose to defend with energy and skill a regenerated stability and decency of life. The historic function of Christianity was to re-establish the moral basis of character and society by providing supernatural sanctions and support for the uncongenial commandments of social order, to instill into rude barbarians gentler ideas of conduct through a creed spontaneously compounded of myth and miracle, of fear and hope and love. There is an epic grandeur sullied with superstition and cruelty in the struggle of the new religion to capture, tame, and inspire the minds of brute or decadent men, to forge a uniting empire of faith that would again hold men together, as they had once been held by the magic of Greece or the majesty of Rome. Institutions and beliefs are the offspring of human needs, and understanding must be in terms of these necessities. 1. The organization of the Church. If art is the organization of materials, the Roman Catholic Church is among the most imposing masterpieces of history. Through 19 centuries, each heavy with crisis, she has held her faithful together, following them with her ministrations to the ends of the earth, forming their minds, molding their morals, encouraging their fertility, solemnizing their marriages, consoling their bereavements, lifting their momentary lives into eternal drama, harvesting their gifts, surviving every heresy and revolt, and patiently building again every broken support of her power. How did this majestic institution grow? It began in the spiritual hunger of men and women harassed with poverty, wearied with conflict, awed by mystery, or fearful of death. To millions of souls the Church brought a faith and hope that inspired and canceled death. That faith became their most precious possession, for which they would die or kill. And on that rock of hope the Church was built. It was at first a simple association of believers, an ecclesia or gathering. Each ecclesia or church chose one or more presbyteroi, elders, priests, to lead them, and one or more readers, acolytes, subdeacons, and deacons to assist the priest. As the worshippers grew in number and their affairs became more complex, the congregation chose a priest or layman in each city to be an episkopos, overseer, bishop, to coordinate their functioning. As the number of bishops grew, they in turn required supervision and coordination. In the 4th century we hear of archbishops, metropolitans or primates governing the bishops and the churches of a province. Over all these grades of clergy, patriarchs held sway at Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Rome. At the call of a patriarch or an emperor, the bishops and archbishops convened in synods or councils. If a council represented only a province, it was called provincial. If it represented only the East or the West, it was called plenary. If both, it was general. If its decrees were accepted as binding upon all Christians, it was ecumenical, that is, applying to the oikoumene, or total Christian inhabited world. The occasionally resultant unity gave the Church its name of Catholic, or universal. This organization, whose power rested at last upon belief and prestige, required some regulation of the ecclesiastical life. In the first 3 centuries of Christianity, celibacy was not required of a priest. He might keep a wife whom he had married before ordination, but he must not marry after taking holy orders. And no man could be ordained who had married 2 wives, or a widow, a divorcee, or a concubine. Like most societies, the Church was harassed with extremists. In reaction against the sexual license of pagan morals, some Christian enthusiasts concluded from a passage in St. Paul that any commerce between the sexes was sinful. They denounced all marriage and trembled at the abomination of a married priest. The Provincial Council of Gengra, circa 362, condemned these views as heretical, but the Church increasingly demanded celibacy in her priests. Property was being left in rising amounts to individual churches. Now and then a married priest had the bequest written in his name and transmitted it to his children. Clerical marriage sometimes led to adultery or other scandal and lowered the respect of the people for the priest. A Roman synod of 386 advised the complete continence of the clergy, and a year later Pope Siricius ordered the unfrocking of any priest who married or continued to live with his wife. Jerome, Ambrose, and Augustine supported this decree with their triple power, and after a generation of sporadic resistance it was enforced with transient success in the West. The gravest problem of the Church, next to reconciling her ideals with her continuance, was to find a way of living with the state. The rise of an ecclesiastical organization side by side with the officials of the government created a struggle for power in which the accepted subjection of one to the other was the prerequisite of peace. In the East, the Church became subordinate to the state. In the West, she fought for independence, then for mastery. In either case, the union of church and state involved a profound modification of Christian ethics. Tertullian, Origen, and Lactantius had taught that war is always unlawful. The Church, now protected by the state, resigned herself to such wars as she deemed necessary to protect either the state or the Church. She had not in herself the means of force, but when force seemed desirable, she could appeal to the secular arm to implement her will. She received from the state and from individuals splendid gifts of money, temples, or lands. She grew rich, and needed the state to protect her in all the rights of property. Even when the state fell, she kept her wealth. The barbarian conquerors, however heretical, seldom robbed the Church. The authority of the word so soon rivaled the power of the sword. 2. The heretics. The most unpleasant task of ecclesiastical organization was to prevent a fragmentation of the Church through the multiplication of heresies, that is, doctrines contrary to conciliar definitions of the Christian creed. Once triumphant, the Church ceased to preach toleration. She looked with the same hostile eye upon individualism in belief as the state upon secession or revolt. Neither the Church nor the heretics thought of heresy in purely theological terms. The heresy was in many cases the ideological flag of a rebellious locality seeking liberation from the imperial power. So the Monophysites wished to free Syria and Egypt from Constantinople, the Donatists hoped to free Africa from Rome, and as church and state were now united, the rebellion was against both. Orthodoxy opposed nationalism, heresy defended it. The Church labored for centralization and unity, the heretics for local independence and liberty. Arianism, overcome within the empire, won a peculiar victory among the barbarians. Christianity had been first carried to the Teutonic tribes by Roman captives taken in the Gothic invasions of Asia Minor in the 3rd century. The apostle, Ulfilas, who lived possibly from 311 to 381, was not quite an apostle. He was the descendant of a Christian captive from Cappadocia, and was born and raised among the Goths who lived north of the Danube. About 341 he was consecrated as their bishop by Eusebius, the Arian prelate of Nicomedia. When the Gothic chieftain Athanaric persecuted the Christians in his dominions, Ulfilas obtained permission from the Arian Constantius to bring the little community of Gothic Christians across the Danube into Thrace. To instruct and multiply his converts, he patiently translated, from the Greek into Gothic, all the Bible except the books of Kings, which he omitted as dangerously martial. And as the Goths had as yet no written language, he composed a Gothic alphabet based upon the Greek. His Bible was the first literary work in any Teutonic tongue. The devoted and virtuous life of Ulfilas generated among the Goths such confidence in his wisdom and integrity that his Arian Christianity was accepted by them without question. As other barbarians received their Christianity in the 4th and 5th centuries from the Goths, nearly all the invaders of the empire were Arians, and the new kingdoms established by them in the Balkans, Gaul, Spain, Italy, and Africa were officially Arian. Conquerors and conquered differed by only an iota in their faith. The Orthodox held Christ to be identical in being, the Arians considered him only similar in being, with God the Father. But the difference became vital in the politics of the 5th and 6th centuries. By this chance concatenation of events, Arianism held its ground till the Orthodox Franks overthrew the Visigoths in Gaul, Belisarius conquered Vandal Africa and Gothic Italy, and Recared, in 589, changed the faith of the Visigoths in Spain. We cannot interest ourselves today in the many winds of doctrine that agitated the Church in this period. Eunomians, Anamians, Apollinarians, Macedonians, Sabellians, Massalians, Novatians, Priscillianists. We can only mourn over the absurdities for which men have died and will. Manichaeism was not so much a Christian heresy as a Persian dualism of God and Satan, good and evil, light and darkness. It thought to reconcile Christianity and Zoroastrianism, and was bitterly buffeted by both. It faced with unusual candor the problem of evil, the strange abundance of apparently unmerited suffering in a world providentially ruled, and felt compelled to postulate an evil spirit co-eternal with the good. During the 4th century, Manichaeism made many converts in East and West. Several of the emperors used ruthless measures against it. Justinian made it a capital crime. Gradually it faded out, but it left its influence on such later heretics as the Paulicians, Bogomiles, and Albigensians. In 385, a Spanish bishop, Priscillian, was accused of preaching Manichaeism and universal celibacy. He denied the charges. He was tried before the usurping Emperor Maximus at Trier, 2 bishops being his accusers. He was condemned, and over the protests of St. Ambrose and St. Martin, he and several of his companions were burned to death. While meeting all these assailants, the Church found herself almost overwhelmed by the Donatist heresy in Africa. Donatus, bishop of Carthage in 315, had denied the efficacy of sacraments administered by priests in a state of sin. The Church, unwilling to risk so much on the virtues of the clergy, wisely repudiated the idea. The heresy nevertheless spread rapidly in North Africa. It enlisted the enthusiasm of the poor, and the theological aberration grew into a social revolt. Emperors fulminated against the movement. Heavy fines and confiscations were decreed for persistence in it. The power of buying, selling, or bequeathing property was denied to the Donatists. They were driven from their churches by imperial soldiery, and the churches were turned over to Orthodox priests. Bands of revolutionaries, at once Christian and communist, took form under the name of circumcellions, or prowlers. They condemned poverty and slavery, cancelled debts and liberated slaves, and proposed to restore the mythical equality of primitive man. When they met a carriage drawn by slaves, they put the slaves in the carriage and made the master pull it behind him. Usually they contented themselves with robbery, but sometimes, irritated by resistance, they would blind the orthodox or the rich by rubbing lime into their eyes, or would beat them to death with clubs, or so their enemies relate. If they in turn met death, they rejoiced, certain of paradise. Fanaticism finally captured them completely. They gave themselves up as heretics and solicited martyrdom. They stopped wayfarers and asked to be killed, and when even their enemies tired of complying, they leaped into fires or jumped from precipices or walked into the sea. Augustine fought Donatism with every means, and for a time seemed to have overcome it. But when the Vandals arrived in Africa, the Donatists reappeared in great number and rejoiced at the expulsion of the Orthodox priests. A tradition of fierce sectarian hatred was handed down with pious persistence, and left no united opposition when in 670 the Arabs came. Meanwhile, Pelagius was stirring 3 continents with his attack on the doctrine of original sin, and Nestorius was courting martyrdom by doubts concerning the Mother of God. Nestorius had been a pupil of Theodore of Mopsuestia, who lived from possibly 350 to possibly 428, who had almost invented the higher criticism of the Bible. The Book of Job, said Theodore, was a poem adapted from pagan sources. The Song of Songs was an epithalamium of frankly sensual significance. Many of the Old Testament prophecies, supposedly referring to Jesus, alluded only to pre-Christian events, and Mary was the mother not of God, but only of the human nature in Jesus. Nestorius raised himself to the episcopal see at Constantinople in 428, drew crowds with his eloquence, made enemies by his harsh dogmatism, and gave them their opportunity by adopting the ungallant opinion of Theodore about Mary. If Christ was God, then, said most Christians, Mary was Theotokos, God-bearing, the mother of God. Nestorius thought the term too strong. Mary, he said, was mother only of the human, not of the divine nature in Christ. It would be better, he suggested, to call her the mother of Christ. Cyril, Archbishop of Alexandria, preached at Easter in 429 a sermon announcing the Orthodox doctrine, that Mary is the true mother not of the Godhead itself, but of the incarnate Logos, or Word of God, containing both the divine and the human natures of Christ. Pope Celestine I, stirred by a letter from Cyril, called a council at Rome in 430, which demanded that Nestorius be deposed or retract. When Nestorius refused, An ecumenical council at Ephesus in 431 not only deposed but excommunicated him. Many bishops protested, but the people of Ephesus broke out into demonstrations of joy that must have awakened memories of Diana Artemis. Nestorius was allowed to retire to Antioch, but as he continued to defend himself and demand restoration, the Emperor Theodosius II banished him to an oasis in the Libyan desert. He survived many years. At last the Byzantine court took pity on him and sent him an imperial pardon. The messenger found him dying, this circa 451. His followers withdrew to eastern Syria, built churches, established a school of learning at Edessa, translated the Bible, Aristotle, and Galen into Syriac, and played a vital part in acquainting the Muslims with Greek science, medicine, and philosophy. Persecuted by the Emperor Zeno, they crossed into Persia, opened an influential school at Nisibis, flourished under Persian toleration, and founded communities in Balkh and Samarkand, in India and China. Scattered through Asia, they survive to this day, still denouncing Mariolatry. The last great heresy of this turbulent period, and the most momentous in result, was announced by Eutyches, head of a monastery near Constantinople. In Christ, said Eutyches, there were not two natures, human and divine, there was only the divine. Flavian, the Patriarch of Constantinople, called a local synod which condemned this Monophysite heresy and excommunicated Eutyches. The monk appealed to the bishops of Alexandria and Rome. Dioscorus, who had succeeded Cyril, persuaded the Emperor Theodosius to call another council at Ephesus in 449. Religion was subordinated to politics. The Alexandrian See continued its war upon the See of Constantinople. Eutyches was exonerated, and Flavian was assailed with such oratorical violence that he died. The council issued anathemas against any man who should hold that there were two natures in Christ. Pope Leo I had not attended the council, but he sent it several letters, Leo's Tome, supporting Flavian. Shocked by the report of his delegates, Leo branded the council as the robber synod and refused to recognize its decrees. A later council at Chalcedon in 451 acclaimed Leo's letters, condemned Eutyches, and reaffirmed the double nature of Christ. But the 28th canon of this council affirmed the equal authority of the Bishop of Constantinople with that of Rome. Leo, who had fought for the supremacy of his office as indispensable to the unity and authority of the Church, rejected this canon, and a long struggle began between the rival sees. To perfect the confusion, the majority of Christians in Syria and Egypt refused to accept the doctrines of two natures in the one person of Christ. The monks of Syria continued to teach the Monophysite heresy, and when an Orthodox bishop was appointed to the See of Alexandria, he was torn to pieces in his church on Good Friday. Thereafter, Monophysitism became the national religion of Christian Egypt and Abyssinia, and by the 6th century predominated in western Syria and Armenia, while Nestorianism grew in Mesopotamia and eastern Syria. The success of the religious rebellion strengthened political revolt, and when the conquering Arabs in the 7th century poured into Egypt and the Near East, half the population welcomed them as liberators from the theological, political, and financial tyranny of the Byzantine capital. 3. The Christian West. 1. Rome. The bishops of Rome in the 4th century did not show the Church at her best. Sylvester, from 314 to 335, earned the credit for converting Constantine, and pious belief represented him as receiving from the emperor in the donation of Constantine nearly all of Western Europe. But he did not behave as if he owned half the white man's world. Julius I, from 337 to 352, strongly affirmed the supreme authority of the Roman See, but Liberius, from 352 to 366, submitted, through weakness or age, to the Arian dictates of Constantius. Upon his death, Damasus and Ursinus contested the papacy. Rival mobs supported them in the most vigorous tradition of Roman democracy. In one day and in one church, 137 persons were killed in the dispute. Praetextatus, then pagan prefect of Rome, banished Ursinus, and Damasus ruled for 18 years with pleasure and skill. He was an archaeologist and adorned the tombs of the Roman martyrs with beautiful inscriptions. He was also, said the irreverent, an Oriscalpius matronarum, a scratcher of ladies' ears, that is, an expert in wheedling gifts for the Church from the rich matrons of Rome. Leo I, surnamed the Great, held the throne of Peter through the generation of Crisis, from 440 to 461, and by courage and statesmanship raised the apostolic see to new heights of power and dignity. When Hilary of Poitiers refused to accept his decision in a dispute with another Gallic bishop, Leo sent him peremptory orders, and the Emperor Valentinian III seconded these with an epoch-making edict imperially confirming the authority of the Roman bishop over all Christian churches. The bishops of the West generally acknowledged, those of the East resisted, this supremacy. The patriarchs of Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria claimed equal authority with the Roman see, and the furious controversies of the Eastern Church proceeded with scant obeisance to the Bishop of Rome. Difficulties of communication and travel combined with diversity of language to alienate the Western from the Eastern Church. In the West, however, the popes exercised a growing leadership even in secular affairs. They were subject in non-religious matters to the Roman state and prefect, and until the 7th century they sought the confirmation of their election from the emperor. But the distance of the Eastern and the weakness of the Western rulers left the popes preeminent in Rome, and when, in the face of invasion, both Senate and emperor fled, and civil government collapsed, while the popes stood unawed at their posts, their prestige rapidly rose. The conversion of the Western barbarians immensely extended the authority and influence of the Roman see. As rich and aristocratic families abandoned paganism for Christianity, the Roman Church participated more and more in the wealth that came to the Western capital, and Ammianus was surprised to find that the Bishop of Rome lived like a prince in the Lateran palace and moved through the city with the pomp of an emperor. Splendid churches now, in 400, adorned the city. A brilliant society took form, in which elegant prelates mingled happily with ornate women and helped them to make their wills. While the Christian populace joined the surviving pagans at the theater, the races, and the games, a minority of Christians strove to live a life in harmony with the Gospels. Athanasius had brought to Rome 2 Egyptian monks. He had written a life of Anthony, and Rufinus had published for the West a history of monasticism in the East. Pious minds were influenced by the reported holiness of Anthony, Schnaudi, and Pachomius. Monasteries were established in Rome by Sixtus III, from 432 to 440, and Leo I, and several families, while still living in their homes, accepted the monastic rule of chastity and poverty. Roman ladies of wealth, like Marcella, Paula, and 3 generations of the Melanias, gave most of their funds to charity, founded hospitals and convents, made pilgrimages to the monks of the East, and maintained so ascetic a regimen that some of them died of self-denial. Pagan circles in Rome complained that this kind of Christianity was hostile to family life, the institution of marriage, and the vigor of the state, and polemics fell heavily upon the head of the leading advocate of asceticism, one of the greatest scholars and most brilliant writers ever produced by the Christian Church. 2. St. Jerome. He was born about 340 at Stredo, near Aquileia, probably of Dalmatian stock, and was promisingly named Eusebius Hieronymus Sophronius, the reverend, holy named sage. He received a good education at Trier and Rome, learned the Latin classics well, and loved them, he thought, to the point of sin. Nevertheless, he was a positive and passionate Christian. He joined with Rufinus and other friends to found an ascetic brotherhood in Aquileia, and preached such counsels of perfection that his bishop reproved him for undue impatience with the natural frailties of man. He replied by calling the bishop ignorant, brutal, wicked, well-matched with the worldly flock that he led, the unskillful pilot of a crazy bark. Leaving Aquileia to its sins, Jerome and some fellow devotees went to the Near East and entered a monastery in the Chalcis desert near Antioch in 374. The unhealthy climate was too much for them. 2 died, and Jerome himself was for a time on the verge of death. Undeterred, he left the monastery to live as an anchorite in a desert hermitage, with occasional relapses into Virgil and Cicero. He had brought his library with him and could not quite turn away from verse and prose whose beauty lured him, like some girlish loveliness. His account of the matter reveals the medieval mood. He dreamt that he had died, and was dragged before the judge's judgment seat. I was asked to state my condition, and replied that I was a Christian. But he who presided said, "Thou liest, thou art a Ciceronian, not a Christian. For where thy treasure is, there will thy heart be also." Straightway I became dumb, and then I felt the strokes of the whip, for he had ordered me to be scourged. At last the bystanders fell at the knees of him who presided, and prayed him to pardon my youth and give me opportunity to repent of my error, on the understanding that the extreme of torture should be inflicted upon me if ever I read again the books of Gentile authors. This experience was no sweet or idle dream. I profess that my shoulders were black and blue, and that I felt the bruises long after I awoke. Henceforth I read the books of God with greater zeal than I had ever given before to the books of men. In 374 he returned to Antioch and was ordained a priest. In 382 we find him in Rome as secretary to Pope Damasus, and commissioned by him to make an improved Latin translation of the New Testament. He continued to wear the brown robe and the tunic of an anchorite, and lived an ascetic life amid a luxurious papal court. The pious Marcella and Paula received him into their aristocratic homes as their spiritual adviser, and his pagan critics thought he enjoyed the company of women more than became so passionate a praiser of celibacy and virginity. He replied by satirizing the Roman society of the age in ageless terms. Those women who paint their cheeks with rouge and their eyes with belladonna, whose faces are covered with powder, whom no number of years can convince that they are old, who heap their heads with borrowed tresses and behave like trembling schoolgirls before their grandsons. Gentile widows flaunt silk dresses, deck themselves in gleaming jewelry, and reek of musk. Other women put on men's clothing, cut their hair short, blush to be women, and prefer to look like eunuchs. Some unmarried women prevent conception by the help of potions, murdering human beings before they are conceived. Others, when they find themselves with child as the result of sin, secure abortion with drugs. Yet there are women who say, "To the pure all things are pure. Why should I refrain from the food which God made for my enjoyment?" He scolds a Roman lady in terms that suggests an appreciative eye. "Your vest is slit on purpose. Your breasts are confined in strips of linen. Your chest is imprisoned in a tight girdle. Your shawl sometimes drops so as to leave your white shoulders bare, and then it hastily hides what it intentionally revealed." Jerome adds to the moralist's bias the exaggerations of the literary artist molding a period, and of a lawyer inflating a brief. His satires recall those of Juvenal or of our own time. It is pleasant to know that women have always been as charming as they are today. Like Juvenal, Jerome denounces impartially, fearlessly, and ecumenically. He is shocked to find concubinage even among Christians, and more shocked to find it covered by the pretense of practicing chastity the hard way. From what source has this plague of dearly beloved sisters found its way into the Church? Whence come these unwedded wives? These novel concubines, these one-man harlots? They live in the same house with their male friends. They occupy the same room, often the same bed. Yet they call us suspicious if we think that anything is wrong. He attacks the Roman clergy, whose support might have raised him to the papacy. He ridicules the curled and scented ecclesiastics who frequent fashionable society, and the legacy-hunting priest who rises before dawn to visit women before they have gotten out of bed. He condemns the marriage of priests and their sexual digressions, and argues powerfully for clerical celibacy. Only monks, he thinks, are true Christians, free from property, lust, and pride. With an eloquence that would have enlisted Casanova, Jerome calls upon men to give up all and follow Christ, asks the Christian matrons to dedicate their firstborn to the Lord as offerings due under the law, and advises his lady friends, if they cannot enter a convent, at least to live as virgins in their homes. He comes close to rating marriage as sin. "I praise marriage, but because it produces me virgins." He proposes to cut down by the axe of virginity the wood of marriage, and exalts John the celibate apostle over Peter, who had a wife. His most interesting letter, in 384, is to a girl, Eustochium, on the pleasures of virginity. He is not against marriage, but those who avoid it escape from Sodom and painful pregnancies and bawling infants and household cares and the tortures of jealousy. He admits that the path of purity is also hard, and that eternal vigilance is the price of virginity. Virginity can be lost even by a thought. Let your companions be those who are pale of face and thin with fasting. Let your fasts be of daily occurrence. Wash your bed and water your couch nightly with tears. Let the seclusion of your own chamber ever guard you. Ever let the bridegroom sport with you within. When sleep falls upon you, he will come behind the wall and will put his hand through the door and will touch your belly, And you will awake and rise up and cry, I am sick with love. And you will hear him answer, A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. The publication of this letter, Jerome tells us, was greeted with showers of stones. Perhaps some readers sensed a morbid prurience in these strange counsels in a man apparently not yet free from the heat of desire. When, a few months later, in 384, the young ascetic Placilla died, many blamed the austerities that had been taught her by Jerome. Some pagans proposed to throw him into the Tiber with all the monks of Rome. Unrepentant, he addressed to the hysterically mournful mother a letter of consolation and reproof. In the same year, Pope Damasus passed away, and his successor did not renew Jerome's appointment as papal secretary. In 385 he left Rome forever, taking with him Blasilla's mother Paula and Eustochium, her sister. At Bethlehem he built a monastery of which he became head, a convent over which first Paula and then Eustochium presided, a church for the common worship of the monks and nuns, and a hospice for pilgrims to the Holy Land. He made his own cell in a cave, gathered his books and papers there, gave himself up to study, composition, and administration, and lived there the remaining 34 years of his life. He quarreled at Penn's Point with Chrysostom, Ambrose, Pelagius, and Augustine. He wrote with dogmatic force 100 works on questions of casuistry and biblical interpretation, and his writings were eagerly read even by his enemies. He opened a school in Bethlehem where he humbly and freely taught children a variety of subjects, including Latin and Greek. Now a confirmed saint, he felt that he could read again the classic authors whom he had forsworn in his youth. He resumed the study of Hebrew, which he had begun in his first sojourn in the East, and in 18 years of patient scholarship he achieved that magnificent and sonorous translation of the Bible into Latin which is known to us as the Vulgate, and remains as the greatest and most influential literary accomplishment of the 4th century. There were errors in the translation, as in any work so vast, and some barbarisms of common speech which offended the purists, but its Latin formed the language of theology and letters throughout the Middle Ages, poured Hebraic emotion and imagery into Latin molds, and gave to literature 1,000 noble phrases of compact eloquence and force. The Latin world became acquainted with the Bible as never before. Jerome's translation was mostly direct from the original Hebrew or Greek. At times, however, he translated from the Greek versions of Aquila, Symmachus, or Theodotion. His translation, revised in 1592 and 1907, is still the standard Latin text of the Bible for the Roman Catholic world. The Douay Bible is the English version of this Vulgate. Jerome was a saint only in the sense that he lived an ascetic life devoted to the Church. He was hardly a saint in character or speech. It is sad to find in so great a man so many violent outbursts of hatred, misrepresentation, and controversial ferocity. He calls John, Patriarch of Jerusalem, a Judas, a Satan, for whom hell can never provide adequate punishment. He describes the majestic Ambrose as a deformed crow, and to make trouble for his old friend Rufinus, he pursues the dead Origen with such heresy-hunting fury as to force the condemnation of Origen by Pope Anastasius in 400. We might rather have pardoned some sins of the flesh than these acerbities of the soul. His critics punished him without delay. When he taught the Greek and Latin classics, they denounced him as a pagan. When he studied Hebrew with a Jew, they accused him of being a convert to Judaism. When he dedicated his works to women, they described his motives as financial or worse. His old age was not happy. Barbarians came down into the Near East and overran Syria and Palestine in 395. How many monasteries they captured, how many rivers were reddened with blood. The Roman world, he concluded sadly, is falling. While he lived, his beloved Paula, Marcella, and Eustochium died. Almost voiceless and fleshless with austerities and bent with age, he toiled day after day on work after work. He was writing a commentary on Jeremiah when death came. He was a great rather than a good man, a satirist as piercing as Juvenal, a letter writer as eloquent as Seneca, an heroic laborer in scholarship and theology. 3. Christian soldiers. Jerome and Augustine were only the greatest pair in a remarkable age. Among her fathers, the early medieval Church distinguished 8 as doctors of the Church. In the East, Athanasius, Basil, Gregory Nazianzen, John Chrysostom, and John of Damascus. In the west, Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, and Gregory the Great. The career of Ambrose, who lived possibly from 340 to 398, illustrates the power of Christianity to draw into its service first-rate men who, a generation earlier, would have served the state. Born at Trier, son of the prefect of Gaul, he was by every precedent destined to a political career, and we are not surprised to hear of him next as provincial governor of northern Italy. Residing at Milan, he was in close touch with the Emperor of the West, who found in him the old Roman qualities of solid judgment, executive ability, and quiet courage. Learning that rival factions were gathering at the cathedral to choose a bishop, he hurried to the scene, and by his presence and his words quelled an incipient disturbance. When the factions could not agree on a candidate, someone suggested Ambrose. His name brought the people to an enthusiastic unanimity, and the governor, protesting and still unbaptized, was hurriedly christened, ordained to the diaconate, then to the priesthood, then to the episcopacy, all in 1 week, this in 374. He filled his new office with the dignity and mastery of a statesman. He abandoned the trappings of political position and lived in exemplary simplicity. He gave his money and property to the poor and sold the consecrated plate of his church to ransom captives of war. He was a theologian who powerfully defended the Nicene Creed, an orator whose sermons helped to convert Augustine, a poet who composed some of the Church's earliest and noblest hymns, a judge whose learning and integrity shamed the corruption of secular courts, a diplomat entrusted with difficult missions by both Church and State, a good disciplinarian who upheld but overshadowed the Pope, an ecclesiastic who brought the great Theodosius to penance and dominated the policies of Valentinian III. The young emperor had an Arian mother, Justina, who tried to secure a church in Milan for an Arian priest. The congregation of Ambrose remained night and day in the beleaguered church in a holy sit-down strike against the empress's orders to surrender the building. Then it was, says Augustine, that the custom arose of singing hymns and songs, after the use of the eastern provinces, to save the people from being utterly worn out by their long and sorrowful vigils. Ambrose fought a famous battle against the empress and won a signal victory for intolerance. At Nola, in southern Italy, Paulinus, from 353 to 431, exemplified a gentler type of Christian saint. Born in an old rich family of Bordeaux and married to a lady of like high lineage, he studied under the poet Ausonius, entered politics, and rapidly advanced. Suddenly, conversion came to him in the full sense of a turning away from the world. He sold his property and gave all to the poor except enough to keep himself in the barest necessities, and his wife Therasia agreed to live with him as his chaste sister in Christ. The monastic life not yet having established itself in the West, they made their modest home at Nola a private monastery and lived there for 35 years, abstaining from meat and wine, fasting many days in every month, and happy to be released from the complexities of wealth. The pagan friends of his youth, above all his old teacher Ausonius, protested against what seemed to them a withdrawal from the obligations of civic life. He answered by inviting them to come and share his bliss. In a century of hatred and violence, he kept to the end a spirit of toleration. Pagans and Jews joined Christians at his funeral. Paulinus wrote charming verse, but only incidentally. The poet who best expressed the Christian view in this age was the Spaniard Aurelius Prudentius Clemens, circa 348 to 410. While Claudian and Ausonius cluttered their compositions with dead gods, Prudentius sang in the ancient meters the new and living themes. Stories of the martyrs, Peri Stephanon or Book of Crowns, hymns for every hour of the day, and an answer in verse to Symmachus's plea for the Statue of Victory. It was in this last poem that he made a memorable appeal to Honorius to suppress gladiatorial combats. He did not hate the pagans. He had kind words for Symmachus and even for Julian, and he begged his fellow Christians not to destroy pagan works of art. He shared Claudian's admiration for Rome and rejoiced that one might pass through most of the white man's world and be under the same laws, everywhere secure. Wherever we are, we live as fellow citizens. In this Christian poet we catch a last echo of the achievement and mastery of Rome. It was not Rome's least glory that Gaul had now so high a civilization. Corresponding to Ausonius and Sidonius in literature were the great bishops of 4th century Gaul, Hilary of Poitiers, Remy of Reims, Euphronius of Autun, Martin of Tours. Hilary, who died circa 367, was one of the most active defenders of the Nicene Creed and wrote a treatise in 12 books struggling to explain the Trinity. Yet in his modest see at Poitiers we see him living the good life of a devoted churchman, rising early, receiving all callers, hearing complaints, adjusting disputes, saying Mass, preaching, teaching, dictating books and letters, listening to pious readings at his meals, and every day performing some manual labor like cultivating the fields or weaving garments for the poor. This was the ecclesiastic at his best. St. Martin left more of a name. 3,675 churches and 425 villages in France bear it today. He was born in Pannonia about 316. At 12, he wished to become a monk, but at 15 his father compelled him to join the army. He was an unusual soldier, giving his pay to the poor, helping the distressed, practicing humility and patience, as if he would make a monastery out of the army camp. After 5 years in military service, Martin realized his ambition and went to live as a monk in a cell, first in Italy, then at Poitiers, near the Hilary he loved. In 371, the people of Tours clamored to have him as their bishop, despite his shabby garments and rough hair. He agreed, but insisted on still living like a monk. 2 miles from the city, at Marmoutier, he built a monastery, gathered together 80 monks, and lived with them a life of unpretentious austerity. His idea of a bishop was of a man who not only celebrated Mass, preached, administered the sacraments, and raised funds, but also fed the hungry, clothed the naked, visited the sick, and helped the unfortunate. Gaul loved him so that all its parts told stories of his miracles, even of his having raised 3 men from the dead. France made him one of her patron saints. The monastery that Martin had founded at Poitiers in 362 was the first of many that now sprang up in Gaul. Because the monastic idea had come to Rome through Athanasius's Life of Anthony and Jerome's powerful call to the anchoritic life, the West first took up the most arduous and lonely forms of monasticism and tried to practice in less genial climates the rigors of monks living under the Egyptian sun. The monk Wulfilic lived for years with bare legs and feet on a column at Trier. In winter the nails fell from his toes and icicles hung from his beard. St. Senex, near Tours, enclosed himself so narrowly within 4 walls that the lower half of his body could not move. In this situation he lived many years, an object of veneration to the populace. St. John Cassian brought the ideas of Pachomius to balance the ecstasy of Anthony. Inspired by some sermons of Chrysostom, he established a monastery and convent at Marseille in 415 and wrote for it the first Western regimen for the monastic life. Before he died in 435, some 5,000 monks in Provence were living by his rule. Soon after 400, St. Honoritus and St. Capricius built a monastery on the island of Lerins, facing Cannes. These institutions trained men to cooperative labor, study, and scholarship, rather than to solitary devotion. They became schools of theology and vitally influenced the thought of the West. When the rule of St. Benedict came to Gaul in the next century, it built upon the tradition of Cassian, one of the most beneficent religious orders in history. 4. The Christian East. 1. The monks of the East. As the Church ceased to be a set of devotees and became an institution governing millions of men, she tended to adopt a more lenient view of human frailty and to tolerate, sometimes to share, the pleasures of this world. This book is continued on Cassette 3, Side 1.